Are you one of the many busy professionals working in offices day in and day out? Do you wonder how some people grow their wealth fast, retire early, and play on workdays? Well, you're in luck, because Ginny Bolling hosts this show, Pivot to Prosperity, where she interviews people that can do just that. Play on workdays. Many guests have become financially free. She also interviews people that are on their journey and people that are in support roles, like attorneys, contractors, brokers, and others. Commercial real estate is the common element. She is on a mission to be sure busy professionals know they can own substantial commercial properties too, like apartments, self-storage facilities, and others, and not have to do the work managing them. Passive investing is the key. Syndications are the typical method. Tax write-offs are some of the biggest rewards. Ginny and partners find the deals, build a strong team and business plan, then offer the investment opportunities to passive investors. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 12, so watch for new releases. If you want to get involved, let us know. You need to get pre-qualified to hear about most deals. See the show notes for contact information.
Hello. Ginny Bolling here with Pivot to Prosperity, brought to you by Pivotal Real Estate Investments. And today we have Keith Fountain with us. Keith, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Jenny, for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, we've talked about it for a while, so I'm so glad to have you because you are doing very unique things in the world. And I've known you for, gosh, probably 5 or 6 years, I guess. But we've never done work on a particular property together. But I find it very interesting every time you're speaking, and you speak at a lot of places. You're quite the authority on conservation easements. So I would like to turn it over to you to talk about a little on how you got into it and what you do.
Okay, well, thank you. So I've been doing conservation real estate for a little over 33 years now. And it's interesting. I'm a lawyer, but when I was in law school, wasn't necessarily thinking of this career. But in 1992, I started doing conservation real estate when I was hired at the Nature Conservancy. That's a national nonprofit. And I was hired not as an attorney, interestingly, even though that's why I started interviewing with them. But they hired me as what was called a field representative at that time. So that was a deal maker, somebody who would go into the field and work with landowners to put together conservation land deals. When I'm talking about conservation land deals, I'm speaking about really one of two things, either a government or a nonprofit um, purchasing land in fee simple for conservation, or we'll be talking a lot today about conservation easements, which is essentially the purchase of the development rights. But anyway, I worked with the Nature Conservancy for about 19 years. The last half of that, I was the director of all their real estate activities statewide. And that was really back during the heyday of the Nature Conservancy's land deals and conservation. So put together, you know, great track record, had a lot of staff, really became known as a person with all the agencies and the partners involved in conservation. When I left the Nature Conservancy in 2012, I started a consulting business to work directly most of the time with landowners. So I was moving from the buying side to essentially the selling side. Did that for a few years and then realized that there weren't many attorneys in Florida with the depth of knowledge that I had in this field. So that's when I launched my law firm in 2016, I believe it was, and started Keith Fountain Law. And the law firm is to serve landowners who want to do these conservation transactions. Some want to sell their land. Most of them want to do these conservation easements. And I represent people and have represented people, Jenny, all the way from, let me think about this, Martin County, all the way out to Pensacola. So my clients are spread across the state. I would say 75% of them are ranchers in one way or another. Many of my clients are located south of the I-4 corridor, but I also got landowners who own small and large, some very large timberland tracts. So those are the people who are my clients today. And lastly, I would say that I've been very fortunate. Last year was a big year for me, and last year I went over $1 billion in value for the transactions I have done in my career.
Wow, that is a big number. Wow. So you've kept track all these years?
Well, so what I did is when I was at the Nature Conservancy, I did a lot of transactions, small and large. Back at that time, I actually had 5 people working in my department that were buying quarter-acre subdivision lots, if you can believe that, primarily in Highlands County and Brevard County. These were these failed subdivisions that didn't have infrastructure put in and they had high conservation value. But yeah, so I ran a database report back then, and as memory serves me, I think I had gotten to about $670 million back then. And then since I launched my own business, there's been far less transactions. I can keep track of them on an Excel spreadsheet. But like I said, last year I went over $1 billion in value for a career.
Congratulations. Wow, that's a lot. So
Thanks.
so what makes these landowners, so remember now I'm more into the I'm not into development really, but it's akin to development, with renovations, a lot of urban renewal kinds of things, but it does touch into development. Why would they want to sell their land into conservation? Talk to that piece.
So there's a number of reasons, and when I speak on this topic, the first thing I do is I lump the driving forces for people to do this really into 2 categories. One is financial, and the other is a term that I'm going to use legacy. So on the financial side, and this is particularly true with the conservation easements. Typically, if people are selling their land in fee simple, they want the state to own and manage it. A conservation easement, you're only selling the development rights. So while the government agency or nonprofit may be receiving this interest in your land, the interest that they're receiving is the responsibility to monitor and make sure you don't violate the restrictions that the conservation easement is placing on your land. So underlying all that is a situation where the landowner wants to retain ownership of the property. So, what I've seen through my career, the financial drivers for people to do these transactions, and again, this largely applies to these agricultural operators, they want to expand their agricultural operations. So, a rancher who's got a 1,000-acre ranch, he's managing cattle, he can sell a conservation easement, get a significant chunk of what the property's actually worth. And then he can take that money and do a 1031 transaction and go buy more ranch land. So that's one reason. Another thing is some of these people, these agricultural producers in particular, they'll sell a conservation easement and they'll do a 1031 and put that money into other types of investment property, commercial real estate, things like that. Some of them will do these deals and then pay off debt. Some people, you don't see a lot of this in Florida because there's so much money available to do these deals, but some people donate conservation easements and they take an income tax deduction. If it's done properly, you can take a charitable contribution on your income tax return. On the in the legacy category, these are the people that are doing it really for one of a couple of reasons. They're either absolutely intent on protecting the natural resources on their property, or maybe you see this with a lot of these ranchers, they want to protect that rural way of life. For some of these ranchers, they may be fifth, sixth, seventh generation. So they want to protect that. I remember I had one client who just absolutely could not envision his property being developed. So he did it to prevent the development of his property. And then the last reason, and this could go in financial or legacy, but I put it in the legacy category, and that, these multi-generation agricultural families, as they're moving down into the younger generations, you start to have people who they don't want to be in agriculture. So their desires to sell the land for development, even their voice, their vote, whatever you want to call it, that becomes a risk. So, a lot of these landowners are selling these conservation easements, taking that money and buying out these disinterested or untrusted family members, if that's what you want to call it. But that's
Mhm.
the 2 main categories.
Interesting. Okay. So if they do this conservation easement and they have an ag use going on, they can continue the ag use usually?
Yes, absolutely. And we have two programs that dwarf all the others in terms of money available here in the state of Florida, that have two different underlying purposes. So many people in Florida have heard about the Florida Forever program. It's been around a couple of decades now. That's a program that's geared to environmental preservation. So if you're a landowner that wants to do a conservation easement that's really focused on protecting the intrinsic conservation value you have on your land, you might want to go to that program. The other program we've got is called the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program. It's administered by the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. It's an agricultural easement program. So the goal of that program is to protect land that is valuable to agriculture that may otherwise be threatened by development or some other use. And under both programs, you can continue agriculture. Now, there is a difference. This rural and family lands agricultural easement, you're pretty wide open in the types of agriculture that you can pursue. A Florida Forever easement, which is again, it's geared more towards protecting the environmental attributes, they're going to try to restrict the agriculture to uses that are compatible with those conservation purposes.
So no phosphates, you're draining into important environmentally sensitive lands, things like that, right?
Yeah, so fundamentally, all these conservation easements, as we have this conversation, they are stripping away all the industrial, commercial, except for agricultural rights, all what I call the retail residential or large scale residential rights, all that's being stripped off the property in perpetuity. Some of these easements do allow people to retain the right to build, one, two, three family homes on the property, something like that. But large scale uses that are destructive to the environment or agriculture, those are wiped out by the conservation easement.
Okay. So if you've got somebody that's doing timberlands and harvesting them, that's not the right word term, I forget. I don't think it is. Anyway, are they allowed to continue that if they're in, say, not the, well, I guess either, but can they continue with something like that?
Yes, yes. So, silviculture, which is the harvesting, the growing and harvesting of timber, that's an agricultural use in Florida. And absolutely. So if you've got a property and I've got a number of clients like this, and these are some of my biggest clients in terms of property size. They have these big tracts of timberland. They've been managed for years. A lot of them have been managed for years by industrial parties like Weyerhaeuser, Rayonier, something like
Yeah.
that. But they've eventually come into private ownership. These people want to keep these properties like this. And so, yes, they would do a conservation easement. From a conservation perspective, the agencies love to keep these properties in timber development, and actually don't
Right.
want to see it replaced with other types of agriculture. However, you've asked an interesting question. In Florida, we got all these people that own timberland that are very interested in putting easements on their property, but putting easements on the property that keep them in timber only. And by that I mean, don't allow them to transition to cattle or row crops or something like that. It's being threatened by the marketplace because more and more of our mills are closing down here in Florida. And if you're going to put a perpetual restriction on property that leaves you with only the ability to harvest timber for income, you've got to have a mill to deliver those trees to. And that's becoming an issue in Florida.
So do you go back and amend these sometimes?
Well, good, very good question. So conservation easements are amendable, if you can put them within a set of constraints to doing so. Now, the state agencies, your question couldn't be more timely because the state agencies have not amended a conservation easement, to my knowledge, until the last agenda before our Florida cabinet, which was in late September. And they had an item on the agenda to amend the conservation easement up in, I believe it was probably St. Johns County, somewhere up in Northeast Florida. But yes, somebody came in and they agreed to move it forward and amend that easement. But you can amend them, but it's very difficult.
Well, forever is a very long time though.
Yes, it is.
And things change, but yeah, no, I so love that there are people that want to do that because I moved from the country in Virginia where we had horses to Los Angeles and I went bonkers with all the concrete. I just really was depressed. I hated it. And so I totally get, that there's a lot of things that need to be protected. And I've been, as you know, part of different right-of-way programs over the years that buy different things. I've never gotten into the conservation so much, but um, you deal with all kinds of things then because you've got land that has, well, what is your average size property that you've transacted? Is there an average? I guess you could average it.
I could average it. I would say the average is probably the median is probably somewhere in there between 1 and 5,000 acres. I've had, just the inventory of clients that I've had over the last 3 or 4 years. I would say I'm thinking about this. I know I've done a conservation easement for a client who had a 120 acre ranch in Highlands County, so very small.
Yeah.
And I did a conservation transaction for a client that had 27,000 acres in a single tract. I've got a client right now who's probably owns more than 40,000 acres in several properties. I've got several clients right now between 8 and 15,000 acres in size. So they're all over the board.
That's
You've got
amazing.
small ranches, small timberlands, but also some very large ones as well.
All right. And so we talked about this a little before we started recording. So what do you have to do for due diligence in this?
Well, so I'll kind of walk you through my process with the typical client. So most people come to me owning land that a lot of it's in agriculture. Some of it are what I'll call recreational lands, timberlands, or maybe just a gentleman's ranch where the
Hunting?
owner's primarily interested in having fun out there, having a place to cook steak on the weekend and hunt or something. But when they come to me, they've typically heard of conservation easements. It's kind of like the conversation we're having here today. And they think they want to do one. So, the first level that I have with them is I'm counseling them on what a conservation is and the type of programs that are involved. One of the things I do immediately is try to target them towards the appropriate program. And again, the underlying assumption here is most of these people want to sell. I've only got one person right now this year that's actually looking at donating. So most people want to sell. So you've
They
got to
want to
start.
sell, but they want to protect it so that it's not going to be developed.
Yes, yes. So they want to sell the conservation easement, not donate the conservation easement. And so you got to point them towards a program where, their vision for the property matches up with the purpose of the program. And I'll give you an example that kind of leads to our earlier conversation. If I've got a client who their primary desire is agricultural production and flexibility in agricultural production, they need to go to this rural and family lands program we were talking about because that easement is going to be very permissive as to the types of agriculture that can be done on the property. If I've got a client who just says, you know what, I just want to stay in cattle, but I really, really want to protect my conservation resources, then maybe I steer them towards Florida Forever. But that's step number one, getting these people into the right program and a program where they can compete for money. Because these programs have the line forming at these programs to do these deals is way longer than the money that's available. The other due diligence items involve their title. If they've got a mortgage, you've got to deal with that. If they've got third-party mineral interests, you got to deal with that. Sometimes there's access issues I need to deal with. But that's generally the due diligence items that I go through. I help my clients a lot with the appraisal process. The design of the conservation easement can have an impact on the valuation. So, yeah, there's a conservation easements are 10 times the difficulty of a fee simple transaction. So there is a lot of counseling and a lot of decisions for landowners to make along the way.
So for instance, and there was a lot to unpack there, but would you usually exclude access points from the conservation easement?
So what is typically excluded from the easement is either portions of the property that have significant development on them already, like maybe a nice hunting lodge, and they want to maybe put some other things in the future around it, or the primary cutout is going to be future residential sites. As you can imagine, particularly these ranching families where the properties have been in their family's ownership for generations, a lot of people are thinking, well, my kids may want to put a house out here, so I'm going to cut out an area where they can put that house. That's the primary areas that are cut out of easements.
Interesting. Okay. And you touched on mineral rights. We got to talk about those. What do you have to do for those?
For what, the mineral rights?
Yeah.
Yeah. So mineral rights are not necessarily the showstopper that they can be in a commercial transaction. And most of the people listening to this are probably involved in commercial real estate, know that if you've got a third party mineral interest that has a right of entry to come onto the property to extract and develop that resource, you've got to extinguish that. It's not necessarily the case in a conservation transaction because if you think about it, a conservation tract, which again is normally an agricultural tract, there are places you could go out there and drill an oil well or something like that and not necessarily upset the purposes of the easement. So the analysis that's done in a conservation easement transaction, it's a risk analysis essentially. Is if you've got a third party interest with a right of entry that and the resource is there and it's likely that somebody is going to come and try to exploit that resource, then yes, you've got to extinguish that interest or at least extinguish that right of entry. However, if you've got an interest, and I'm going to use oil and gas.
Yeah.
Most people will probably know oil and gas is only extracted in two areas in Florida, very limited, down in Southwest Florida and up in the Panhandle out in the Northwest. For much of the rest of the state, if that third party interest is an oil and gas interest, you can get a memorandum or an assessment done by a geological company or the Florida Geological Survey that says, listen, the chances of any kind of extraction here are so negligible as to be remote. And that's a form of risk assessment. So the assessment is being made that it's highly, highly, highly unlikely that this third party interest will come onto this property and do anything disruptive, so we can close the deal anyway. And that's the way minerals are handled. It's called a remoteness determination. That's something we do a lot here in the state. Obviously, oil and gas is one thing. If you've got sand, clay, gravel, and a lot of Florida, that's a much more concerning third party interest for the party doing this kind of transaction because that's surface mining, that's very disruptive. Those resources are far more widespread around the state.
What did you list? Sand, what else?
Sand, clay, gravel, items
What?
like that, particularly sand, phosphate in certain places. These are much more problematic mineral interests to have to take care of.
Yeah, I can imagine. Interesting. Well, so have you ever known anybody to come in and start extracting using their mineral rights to take sand and phosphates or whatever?
No, I've never seen it on one of my clients' land. Thankfully, most of my clients, if they have a third party interest, it's an oil and gas interest, and it usually is
Yeah.
just doesn't even come into play.
Right. Interesting. Well, so then also you mentioned you have to deal obviously with the mortgage companies. So do they usually want a bunch of that money?
Well, what typically so the legal situation that you have with a mortgage is that you can't have a situation where the mortgage is superior to the easement and the foreclosure of the mortgage could extinguish the easement. So one of two things has to happen. Either the proceeds from the easement transaction need to pay off the mortgage so that it's satisfied, or well, three things can happen. Sometimes people are doing easements only over a portion of the property. So you can do a partial release of the mortgage where the mortgage remains on the portion of the property not going under easement and the rest of it's released. Or you can do a subordination. And that's where the mortgage holder agrees to let their lien become junior to that of the conservation easement. So, but you have to deal with it one way or another.
That's my world. The subordinations, when we were cutting into buildings or, leaving very little on a property, usually the mortgage company wanted all, if not most of the money. So, yeah, it was always a fight because the property owner might be wanting to implement a cure. So we had to try to convince the bank to at least let them have the cure money, right? So,
Right. With an easement, I will say that, when you're selling that easement interest, the value the value that you retain in the property is often can be as high as 50%, sometimes even more. So, unless you're highly in debt, you can probably subordinate it because you still have a valuable real estate asset there. But the lender, the mortgagee, they're going to have to do an assessment and look at what that land is worth with the easement on it to see if they're still secure in their loan.
so is that 50% a rough way of looking at what the building rights are worth when you're
Very, it's a very rough way. I
yeah.
have, as you can imagine, Jenny, all my clients in that first conversation, they're like, "Well, what am I going to get paid?"
Yep.
And the answer to that is it depends.
Yep.
To understand that a little bit better, just very quickly, the way conservation easements are appraised is the appraisers actually come up with two numbers. The first number is the as-is value of the property based on its highest and best use, which in much of Florida is going to be development. The second number is the value of the property subject to the easement that is being put on the property. Now, these easements are very negotiable and the terms are very negotiable. So the amount of restriction on that easement can vary widely. So what the appraiser is doing is looking, that second number is the value of that property after that easement that's being recorded is placed on that land. And then you take number one, the as is value, you subtract the after value, that's the value of the easement. And what I tell my clients, except in some very, very remote corners of the state, what I see most of my clients are getting paid on these conservation easements, I'd say between 50 and 65% of the as is value of the land.
Of the as is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that as is though, well, you mentioned potential development, but if it doesn't have zoning or land use, that's not very great because then you have to figure the whole year plus of trying to change those things, right?
Well, either that or, there's a lot of value inherent in particularly some of our rural counties in just taking a piece of land and busting it up into 10-acre tracts.
Oh,
So,
yeah, right. Yeah.
yeah. So there's, like I said, I would say the percentage wise of my clients over the last couple of years, the lowest I've seen anyone get paid is down in the low 30%. And the highest is up around 72, 74%. So
Interesting.
obviously that high number, that's in an area that's has a lot of development pressure.
Gotcha. Okay. So something we have to touch on since I am in syndications and I didn't realize how well, I didn't realize syndications were doing this kind of thing. We have to talk about those because they're making a bad name for some of us, I think.
Well,
Um,
they're not making a bad name for you, but you're right. Syndication in your world is a good term. In the conservation easement world, it's often a bad term. And this is why it's so. I don't know when this started, probably 15 years ago or so. But what people started doing, and when I say people, this is, promoters. Unfortunately, there were some land trusts that were involved in this and some appraisers that were very involved in this. But what they started doing was finding property, going and get a number of investors to come in and buy that property. And I'm just going to say for X, and then immediately donate a conservation easement and claim that the value of that conservation easement was, let's say, 6x, and therefore get a tax deduction. Each one of those investors get a tax deduction that the benefit of that exceeds their investment in the property. And, underlying all these transactions, first and foremost, I think, was fraudulent appraisals. And because if you think about it, I remember sitting in a session in a conference back about 8, 9 years ago where there was a panel up there talking about these syndications and how wrong everything was. And some people were trying to promote it. And somebody said the obvious. And the obvious was this, if you buy a piece of property, certainly from a knowledgeable seller for X, how in the world can you then donate a conservation easement where only the development rights are worth 6x? But
Right.
that's what these transactions were doing. They were getting wealthy investors to buy into an entity like an LLC. That entity would then donate the conservation easement, and the tax benefits of that would pass through to those investors. And the IRS has come down on that with a vengeance. The downside to all of that, the good side is that the fraudulent activities are being halted or certainly slowed down because we don't want the provisions in the tax code, the federal tax code that allow people to get a financial benefit here. We don't want Congress to get rid of those because of abuse.
Right.
So, but the downside of the IRS action is they were very aggressive, and they've created a body of case law over the last 10 or 12 years that just doesn't apply to bad transactions or bad easements, but any conservation easement where somebody's trying to claim a charitable contribution. So we've had a situation the last 5, 8 years, 10 years where you as a landowner and as counsel to those landowners, you have got to make sure you're dotting every I and crossing every T on the technical side of the transaction, the easement itself, and all of the components that go into that transaction.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm glad you differentiated too.
Yeah, and what the IRS, just for the listeners of this, people might wonder how the IRS attacks these things. Well, they really attack it one of two ways. They either go after the appraisal, the valuation, and that's usually a good place to start. But if they're having a hard time with that, they'll go after the easement itself. And what they're really looking at is, and you mentioned this early, perpetual. They're looking at perpetuity, and really one of two things. Is that easement interest itself, or that easement instrument, is it perpetual? And then does that instrument, the way it's drafted, does it protect the conservation resources in perpetuity? And that's what they've gone after in these fraudulent syndicated transactions. And those are the kind of details that you've got to be careful with in conservation easements if you want to claim a charitable contribution.
Makes sense. It does. So it does make me also think about so Trump, I think, is talking about drilling in some of our parks, right? And aren't
Yes,
they
or
protected?
some of our conservation lands for sure. I don't know about national parks per se, but he may be.
Yeah, aren't they protected from that?
They are, although I'm not going to sit here and pretend to understand the federal policy behind it.
Mhm.
What we've seen is the pendulum swinging back and forth, I think, on our federal lands between halting um, extractive activities like like mining or oil drilling. Um, even reducing things like cattle grazing on public lands where that's allowed. Um, Now to actually looking at considering opening these lands back up to those kind of activities. Like anything else, I think there needs to be a balance. We've also seen in the federal arena, there's always a fight. You've probably heard about this roadless rule as they apply to national forests. So
The
that
what rule?
yeah, it's called the roadless rule. It's something that facilitates timber development or timber harvesting in national forests. So, I mean, we see this in our national politics as administrations change and go back and forth. Is the pendulum swinging back and forth on these extractive activities on our public lands? I would offer one comment. Think about you're standing out west and you're looking at one of those great vistas at one of the national parks or even Bureau of Land Management or something like that, any of those public lands. What's the difference in the impact to your view between a large solar field, windmills on a mountain ridge, or a few oil derricks out there, for drilling oil? That's something people need to think about because I think a lot of what we hear and see right now, it's a fight over the type of the extractive activity. And that's what's really varying, I think, administration to administration.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's all very interesting and very important that we going back to well, we didn't have you say your takeaway. We need to conserve the lands, right? So say what you want people to take away from this.
Well, the takeaway from this in Florida, I'm going to assume that most of our listeners in Florida, but maybe not necessarily so, but in Florida, we have a constituency, our citizens, that consistently votes in overwhelming fashion to dump a lot of money into conservation. The last time we had a statewide referendum was in 2014. It passed by 75%. It's giving us like $1 billion a year to put into conservation. One problem in Florida is the Everglades gets most of that, unfortunately, from my perspective. People in South Florida may not agree with that. But we've got to have these programs that I'm describing, like Florida Forever, rural and family lands. We've got to have them well funded year after year after year. And by well funded, I mean at least $250, $300 million a year. The money's there to do that. We're the third largest state in the country. We're still growing rapidly. Urban sprawl is consuming our environmental resources and our agricultural lands, and we want to preserve those. That's the green infrastructure of this state that makes it such an attractive place to live and work. And so the takeaway for people is to stay on their legislators about taking this money that's available. This money comes from documentary stamp tax revenue and taking this money and adequately funding these programs so we can protect these lands while they're still available.
Well said. Yes. Um, and as far as the number of people on the wait list, we weren't recording yet. I think you said there was like 430 people trying to get on these lists to conserve.
Yeah, so as an example, I use the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program that I was talking about earlier. I think their current list, which was developed at the beginning of this year, that was the end of their last application cycle, is about 430 projects long. And they got a lot of money in the legislature this year. They got $250 million. But that money may only go down 70 deep. So, we've got lines a mile long. They're going to open it back up. I'm hearing to more applications late this year, early next year. The agricultural community is lining up at the trough, so to say, with rural and family lands in Florida Forever, trying to do these deals because these people are they're struggling. They've
That's right.
had in many cases families that have been involved in this for generations, or they have some connection with the property from an environmental perspective, and yet they've got developers knocking on their doors on a weekly basis and offering them obnoxious amounts of money. These conservation easements are a way to take this property in another direction that's important to the state, and the programs are they're very popular, but they've got to be well funded.
Amen to that. I was sharing, my trip when I had to move as a kid with my parents to Los Angeles and to see all that concrete. And we actually what happened was I was in sports, and so my mom bought a house up on the top of a mountain thinking, because this was the 70s, smog was bad back then, that I'd be up above that and I could participate in sports. But no, every day there was a report about if there was a smog warning and no running. And couldn't do sports hardly at all anymore for me. But anyway, I would look out and see so much concrete and so little greenery. It just really, I hated being in LA because of that more than anything, really. But yeah, I don't want to see that happen to Florida. I like seeing trees and open space. I think that's really important for people.
It really is, and Floridians love it. We've got our iconic springs that really no place else, I think, certainly in the country has.
Yeah,
And yeah, it's just, we're growing so fast. And again, Floridians consistently support any kind of referenda that puts tax dollars into protecting these lands. But our legislators and our county commissioners, particularly our legislators, they have to fully fund these programs. And that's the takeaway. People need to be advocating for that.
right. Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, very good. Well, so as I ask everybody at the end, I need to wrap this up. Is there a pivotal person or event that's made a difference in your life or that's driving you towards some goal?
Well, people have asked me that throughout my career because I do. It's obvious to people that I really enjoy what I do. It's I enjoy my clients and I enjoy the results because I am a conservationist at heart. And I always tell them, I take it back. I take it back to my childhood and my youth. I think, as a child, typically 2 times a year, we'd go up to my grandmother's farm in Southeast Alabama, and I loved it up there. I loved the agricultural side. I loved the woods. I loved hunting. So, I grew a connection to the land that way. And then in high school and particularly college, spent a lot of time backpacking out west. And I've always loved wildlife, and I've loved the environment, loved the mountains. Interesting side story. I got out of law school. I practiced law 3.5 years and hated it. And then I ran off to Alaska, and I spent 4 months living in the backcountry at a state park as a volunteer.
Wow.
So, that's what drives me. It's a love for the outdoors and our natural spaces, and particularly our wildlife.
Nice, nice. So you have seen lots of buffalo, I guess.
Yes.
The one time I was in Alaska, I could smell one and I kept looking, but I never found him.
Well, people that know me know that I love bears. I've had my bear experiences, and I love a vacation that centers around viewing bears.
Wow. Black bear, any kind of bear?
Well, any kind of bear, but I love the grizzlies, and I've seen them up close, too close one time, and I enjoy wildlife like that.
Nice, nice. All right. Okay, so tell people how they can reach you if they've got questions about conservation easements, want to do one, have to deal with one, something like that. How can they reach you?
Well, they can reach out to me. So I've got a website, www.keithfountainlaw.com. So it's just like my name, KEITHFOUNTAIN law.com. I've got my LinkedIn profile is actually very robust. It's got a lot about my background. It's got some projects that I've done in the past. I try to post exclusively things related to my field of interest, but that's the way to reach out to me.
Great. Okay, we'll put that in the show notes. And I thank you so much for coming on. This was great. I think it's going to be very insightful for a lot of people.
Well, great. I enjoyed it. It's good to get the word out and get people interested in supporting conservation in Florida.
Good. Thank you again.
Thank you.